Welcome to the Meet the RJI winners of the RJI Student Innovation Competition. With us today we have Kendall Porter, who is remote, Katey Williams, also of Team Watchdogs, both of the University of Oregon, and we have Dana Cassidy, who's also remote with us here from the University of Florida, and then we have Josh Schipper of Purdue University Fort Wayne, who's here with us. And so we're just going to get right into it. I'd like each of you to tell me about your projects. Explain what they were and why you wanted to create them. And we'll start with you, Katey.
Yeah, so my team, Watchdogs, we made this website where we put resources for news literacy for middle schoolers, and we also made a game which was a part of that, which goes into this lesson plan that goes over red flags that you can find in news articles that spread misinformation. And basically students first get to learn what is credible news and what a credible news source looks like. And then we also go over what uncredible news sources look like and kind of compare those and then go into the game to kind of test what they've learned. And all those resources are available for teachers all over the country. So they have to do like little to no prep work to have access to that entire lesson plan and the game as well.
Right on. Kendall, do you have anything to add?
Oh yeah, I was going to say that I think Katey did a great job like going over it, but I think that when we first started, we wanted to originally focus on the game part, but then it really started morphing into more about the lesson plan itself, and then about the website to make it the most accessible that we could. We were really inspired by the like Jeopardy review games that we used to play because those were always like our favorite days in like middle school. The ones like really stuck with us. So we wanted to kind of go like be teaching kids information while also making it fun so they would actually be engaged and be learning it. But then we also know that teachers oftentimes don't have very much time to actually prep all of their lesson plans. And when they do, it's directly taking out of their free time. So we wanted to just basically do all the prep work for them so that all they have to do is just download the stuff from the website and then adjust it to any way that they see fit.
Excellent. So Dana, who's also remote, do you want to tell us about your project?
Sure. So my project was the News Literacy Toolkit, which essentially was a web application that I just built from scratch and designed and created all of the content for, which then allowed me to create a tool for fifth graders to learn news literacy in interactive ways. It has 7 chapters of reading, an interactive map with a database of over 400 local newspapers, links to resources for kids' curated news content, as well as many other things, including a quiz and whatnot. And this project was so much fun to work on, but importantly, what the tool does is it implements ideas and strategies similar to that of BrainPop, maybe Khan Academy, because I know growing up, technology was a medium of how I truly interacted and learned with things. And I was fortunate to have it tested and continue to be used in classrooms to this day. And it basically is a tool for fifth graders to really understand the fundamentals of news literacy and have a conversation about what the news is, how to find and verify facts. And really just start that dialogue and trust at a young age when they're on social media and really looking to develop those critical thinking skills.
Well, thank you. And finally, we have Josh Skinner, and you want to tell us about your project?
So what I did was I kind of broke down the question of the innovation competition and tried to find ways to reach people, for news to reach people in ways that they wouldn't have either thought of before or reach people who wouldn't otherwise pick up a newspaper. So what I did was I made these coasters that were interactive with your phone. All you had to do was tap your phone to the coaster at like a bar or a restaurant or something like that. And you get this easy to read, super broken down, condensed kind of web page of news. And so people who would otherwise never see a newspaper, never pick it up, never watch the news, they were now interacting with local news and resources that I attached to that as well.
Right on. So how did you identify the audience that, or the segment of the public that you wanted to engage with?
Well, I put it at kind of more of a public place where there wasn't a heavy, at least from what I observed, striation towards one demographic or another. It's kind of just trying to reach general public. And there's newspaper stands at doors of restaurants, at doors of bars for people to like grab, read a little bit about it. But those, you had to refresh them every week. You had to go deliver them. They cost a lot. And then you had to actually get people to look down and pick it up. But when people are at a table, you've got a coaster in front of you, you read the coaster, and then a coaster that's interactive, you're gonna engage with it because it's cool. So yeah, just targeting people in that respect in a new and innovative way versus the ways that they've traditionally been targeted by news organizations, I think led to, I guess, the results that I ended up seeing with people engaging with the innovation.
And Katey, how did you come about like identifying the audience and the methodology for engaging with them?
I guess we started with like 5th graders because of like the Jeopardy review game idea. And as we started developing the content, we sort of realized that 8th graders might be a better demographic to target for our project. And Kendall can also add more to that and speak about the process of like finding our target audience.
So Kendall, do you want to elaborate for us?
I would love to. I was going to say, we actually tested it out on a 6th, 8th grade blend class. So like half the students were 6th graders, half the students were 8th graders. And we just kind of started noticing that the 8th graders were the ones who were picking it up a bit more and who were understanding it in the way that we were really wanting them to understand it. So while we think that it's still really important information to get across to 6th graders, 8th grade, it's like we would want to kind of change the lesson plan for that age demographic. Another thing that we did is as college students, we kind of forget the small things that we had been learning in middle school, like for example, the vocabulary we had. So there were some words and aspects of our lesson plan that when we were talking to the teacher, he was like, oh, just as a heads up, I don't think that my students will know what the word credible means. So then we would have to go back and change it to like trustworthy. So that was kind of an interesting process in terms of building the lesson plan, was like knowing your audience and really having to go back and fix things so that they would be the ones who are truly understanding it.
And Dana, you with how did you identify the audience and the way that you were engaging with them?
Yeah, great question. So when I chose 5th graders, I decided to do so in order to build a way. Hi, I'm sorry, is my mic working correctly? I'm so sorry. I have some very loud reverb going on.
We can hear you just fine.
Perfect, sorry. So I decided to go with 5th graders because this was an age where you're starting to be really active on social media. And a lot of 5th graders tend to be in that 11 to 12 age range where they're kind of going on social media, but not really understanding a lot of things they're seeing. And I knew from a young age, a lot of the tools I used in classrooms included things that took the lesson plan a step further and allowed me to interact it in graphic, visual ways. And I knew that children, especially during the pandemic, were using Zoom and other technologies to really engage that learning and social situations. So especially as an engineer, I wanted to take a challenge. I wanted to challenge myself to build a tool that allowed me to understand accessibility on a completely different age range than my own, because my background was a lot of building like news sites and tools for journalists or for readers that were expected to be high school or adult. So I wanted to challenge myself as both a content creator in terms of writing the content, designer, as well as an engineer, to make a product that a 5th grader can not only use and enjoy, but really learns from. And I found in my user research, it was also important to really look at how they interacted with the tool outside of just the language and the content itself, which was really fascinating. And using a lot of like user experience design and making sure that, oh, is it intuitive that this aspect is able to be clicked on or this aspect is able to be accessed, which is really important when also gearing in the content and having them have their attention span cut, so keeping it in short sentences. But sorry for that long tangent, but fifth graders are a wonderful age because they really do want to learn, and they were quite smart when I asked them in their personal and classroom user testing, because they are old enough to form questions and think about things critically, but it's important to frame it and help them think of those questions in a way that is proper and on the right track of what is true, what is false, and eventually turns them into educated readers who appreciate the news.
Well, and that's a great segue into kind of the greater ideas of kind of news literacy, media literacy, news literacy in general. So how, what kind of you touched briefly on the way the students were reacting, but could you elaborate on how they on how you see this this in the news literacy landscape?
Sure. So one thing I really appreciate about the tool and the way it's structured in the news literacy landscape is it doesn't require setup. I didn't have to be there. When I was testing in classrooms, I actually didn't know which day and when they were testing it. I just knew the teachers happened to be using it that week because they told me, showing that it's a tool that doesn't really need a ton of guidance to access and use and have a user interact with and really engage with, which was my goal of fitting the news literacy landscape. I feel as journalists, we often find ourselves a bit jaded sometimes, being surrounded by people who appreciate, understand, and think critically about the news. But growing up in an area and around people where I honestly didn't fully understand journalism until I was in college and appreciate what the free press stood for, I figured the best way to create a tool in the news literacy landscape is have it be effective and impactful, but easy to use, always accessible, and always free. Because just to simply pick up the tool and use it is a really important part of news literacy, or else people aren't going to have that conversation unless it's introduced to them at an age where, the same age that we're learning about how the three branches of government work. It's not about the nuance, and it's not about thinking past that. It's more about learning the fundamentals to build that trust and have a conversation, sort of like planting the seeds to have the roots eventually grow into something bigger. Whereas I think in the news literacy space, it's important to focus on those younger generations, which I really appreciate other people seeing and really thinking about that, versus tackling adults who sometimes can just be very jaded in their viewpoints about the news. But children, there's no reason they can't understand the simple tasks and autonomy of what the free press does, as well as they know what the judicial branch does and the legislative branch and executive. So that's why I really enjoy fifth graders, but also technology in a way that keeps everything effective, free, and accessible.
That sounds great. Katey, do you want to elaborate on how your project kind of fits into this greater news literacy landscape and how you're
Yeah, I guess
share.
similar to Dana's project, the reason why we chose a younger audience was because these skills of news literacy need to be taught earlier on, because that kind of builds like a fundamental for later on when they're encountered with a lot of information and they have to quickly decide oh, is this something that looks credible or not? And also, how does this fit into my experience with society and also with the media that I encounter on a daily basis? So that's part of what we were thinking about and also having in our conversations as we were developing our project. And if Kendall also wants to add more to that, feel free.
Oh yeah, I remember part of what inspired me was that I have a younger brother. He's actually 18. He's not young anymore, but he has fallen for what I think is the craziest misinformation, and asked me about it. But it's if he had even at 17, 18, he didn't really have the tools to be able to critically analyze it. And I realized the only difference between both of us was that while it wasn't really taught to either of us in schools, I just sought it out on my own, where it's that is something that should be in schools and should be taught, like Dana was saying, along with basic social science, like along with the like basic social studies and like the government that we're already learning. It's something that is critical for the future of the news and just being an engaged citizen.
And Josh, so with yours, how does it fit into this grand scheme?
So I think I briefly may have touched on it.
A little bit.
But so it really just meeting people where they're at. So for example, I said that we were like, putting this in bars, putting this in places where people already were and they didn't have to go and seek out news. The news was already there for them right at their table. And then I guess on the more digital side, or I guess the end side of that, the coasters would direct them to this simple website that I made. It had 3 local news stories that were broken down. I based the style of writing for these, I guess, summaries of the news stories on AP style. I think a lot of, I guess, journalistic style writing might be a little bit daunting to people. So for example, AP will use certain words that maybe people aren't familiar with. Sometimes writing all the time in active voice isn't always going to be the most welcoming, or like it doesn't feel like you are able to connect with the news when you're always writing in this super professional tone. So breaking down that tone for people who aren't used to reading the news, aren't used to interacting with the news, aren't used to understanding, what all these different mechanics are in sentences. Breaking down those news stories, I think will lead people maybe to understanding more about why people write like that, about, I guess, just the styles of general news. But yeah, breaking that down, I think, was one of the biggest things that I didn't realize I was going to have to do during the project, but that's something that came up towards the end, like, how am I going to write this? I don't really like AP style a whole lot sometimes, 'cause I think it does have a little bit of a learning curve to it when you are even just reading it, not even writing it. You have to understand, why people choose certain words, and that's not always immediately apparent to people.
Absolutely, and as we're seeing, like, the media landscape transform via, with new communication methodologies, new ways of communication, new ways of connecting with people, that language changes. And so that, did you see directly how the like social media and like the nomenclature, the words and the way people communicate with each other within their communities, that shaped how you were modifying the AP style?
I think it did a little bit. I wrote it just, the way I talk, basically, minus a couple, like, I didn't use a whole lot of slang because I didn't want people to have to, like, know, like, certain words that different communities use. I tried to keep it as neutral as possible while still writing in a conversational tone. So people didn't have to live in a certain place. People didn't have to have a certain kind of background. People didn't ever have to have read news ever in order to understand what these stories were trying to say.
And so, Dana, with your project, did you shape the way that you were the way you were communicating to meet audiences? And so, if so, could you share with us a little bit?
Sure. So the way I envision shaping communication toward audience, and obviously I'm coming a bit biased as this as an engineer, a news engineer specifically, I'm very, very passionate about the concept of journalism not being about how you write something, but being about serving information in a way that is best fit for your audience. What does that mean? That can be as simple as making a TikTok about a content piece, because that sometimes gets the message across better than in 1,000-word long form piece. Because as we see nowadays, people's attention spans are shorter and they want to get things across in a way that truly is interactive. So building this tool, I made sure to do this on the content in key ways. I wanted to have different effects that when you scroll, it allows one to be interactive, and as well as the main portion that really geared like the central portion of the content, the reading, I figured a slideshow format was effective in this sense, because if we think about ourselves, for instance, How many times much more personally, and this is a question that may be different for everyone, do you like reading a Twitter thread over a long form article to get the information across faster? I find sometimes a Twitter thread is much more effective in terms of conveying that information journalistically across. So one thing I was thinking about while trying to figure out how to convey this information and shape the way that my audience is consuming it is, how can I get these points across succinctly? So one method that I did was taking concepts in their true vocabulary forms, because I know for fifth graders, they know enough to really understand at least the nuance of it. And when I tested it, they were pretty on the same page as what was going on. So when I was talking about, okay, the First Amendment, free press, freedom of speech, and then breaking it down to be, it's as simple as, you're not going to get in trouble with the government for saying you like Superman over Batman or red over blue, because that's a way my audience that I'm aiming for can better consume the information. And although it is not a journalism piece I was doing, I was trying to make sure my audience was on the same page as me, which is why I'm so passionate about tooling and using technology as a means for it. And I'm a very big advocate of saying that although not everyone might have the title of an engineer, I believe news and newsrooms in the future will look like rooms full of engineers with different titles, but everyone has their hands on some sort of tooling, digital format, and programming, because that is the way everything is shifting toward. So fit your audience's needs when all of them spend most of their time playing Minecraft and online. And I'm like, okay, I can meet this. I know I'm not, and also understand what your tool serves. I know they're not going to be playing with my toolkit probably for hours in their free time. That's what they told me. They're like, I'd rather not be playing that. But if it's in school, I would really like this tool. So shape your tool and shape your means of communication to what your audience best needs and also what best suits your tool.
Right on. Well, thank you. And Kendall, do you want to start off with telling us how you engage the audience that way?
Oh yeah. So I think that the biggest thing for us was, while our project is kind of mainly the lesson plan, we added in the game as a way of engaging our audience, because I guess I realized we didn't really go over what the game was, but essentially we pointed out the 5 things that you really want to look for when seeing if an article is trustworthy or not. And that just includes things like, does it have a writer attached to the name? Is it from a source that is credible? Does it have or is the writing style overly biased, or does it seem more unbiased? Things that we know to look for as journalists, but that younger kids might not necessarily realize. And then we basically made our own fake articles that ranged from being based off of gossip news sites to Associated Press articles. So then we had them basically divide them into groups and try to figure out whether they thought that each article was trustworthy or not. And we did it over Zoom, so we had them do polls, but in other classrooms it would look more like class discussions, votes, dividing into groups or doing it individually depending on the size of the classroom. Basically any way to get the kids engaged, but then also thinking about it. We also know that younger kids are very competitive. Whenever there's a game in school, they will try to win. And that was something that we definitely did notice. So that was one way of kind of finding the audience. But then the second way was knowing that teachers are an audience of ours. So we wanted to put it online where teachers would actually have access to it and would be able to use basically minimal time to download all the resources they need to implement the lesson plan into their classroom.
Katey, do you have anything to add for the project?
Kendall summed it up pretty well, but another thing we noticed was that the kind of viewing journalists as the watchdogs of society and playing the game, we also noticed that the middle schoolers kind of took on their own detective names and they were really having fun with it. And I think a huge part of learning at that age is also remembering key parts that were enjoyable in the learning experience. And I think that's something that they will take away, that they enjoyed, and also learn something pretty critical, especially now that media is being produced at such like a fast scale. That now when they encounter like media that seems like it's quickly produced and it's missing those things that can come with a credible article, that now they know that they're equipped with some of the skills to detect that. Yeah.
Right on. Well, and just for our audience who's watching, if you do have questions, please submit them, and we'll pose them to everyone here. So, but on with each of these projects, you've touched on the idea of the way people communicate changed and have changed over the years, and over time as new technology comes out. How are you seeing, and this is a more broader, maybe a little bit outside of the project, but in general, how are you seeing the changing technology changing the way people have a relationship with media in general, and so.
Well, I mean, the first one is it's always with us. It's always in our pockets. The media can reach you wherever they want to. You get it immediately. As soon as something happens, you know about it. Maybe at most 10 minutes after something happens, you will get a notification about it, which is something that, up until maybe 10, 15 years ago, it never existed. And that the way that media reaches you like that, like they thought that, daily newspapers are pretty innovative. You get your news right away, but this is immediate and wherever you are, not just immediate, but any location that you are. So that's probably, in my opinion, the biggest way that it's changed, especially with social media. And then you have a lot of, I guess, amateur reporters, not necessarily amateur reporters, but people who, you always have a camera with you. And if you're somewhere where you're witnessing an event with, like, that you can take a picture of, you upload it, and that's picture of the year right there, or like everyone's going to know that picture for the next 10 years. Like, I think the best example of that before social media was when President Kennedy was assassinated. We have that one picture that everyone knows, and I don't think it was necessarily a journalist that took a picture of that. I think it was, and we only have one frame there. So just imagine, all of the events where if we had smartphones, if we had people taking pictures that weren't necessarily journalists, everyone would have known about, Lincoln's assassination right away. We would have pictures of the theater. We would have all of this other stuff. So I think that has dramatically changed the landscape of journalism, because, you can deputize all these, I guess, regular, not necessarily regular people, but all of these people who didn't really think of themselves as a reporter. All of a sudden, here you are in this historic event reporting on one of the biggest news stories in the world.
And Katey, how would you like to weigh in on that?
I definitely think of media as a whole as something that is more prevalent in all sectors in society, and that includes education as well, which is why we found it even more important to educate from a younger age, because pretty much every middle schooler has encountered something on social media, or they've been exposed to some kind of media. And now, even in college, pretty much every project you work on could have some media involved in it. So everyone is using it and everyone learns about it, no matter what kind of interests or what they're majoring in. So journalism plays a huge role in everyone's lives. Even if they're not someone who reads the paper, they could even be at the airport and they're seeing the news in front of them happening. So it's just very, I don't know if ubiquitous is the right word for it, but yeah, and for that reason, it's more important to teach news literacy now, because everything is instant, and you can see it everywhere, and it's being taught. So yeah.
Well, and Kendall, do you want to weigh in on that before we turn to Dana?
Oh, of course. I have so many thoughts. I think that what's very interesting about right now is the fact that it's with so much of the push onto social media, it also makes it so that basically the format of a news article or the format of like a press release becomes very easy to replicate or for other people to kind of mimic. If that makes sense, where in like before, if you thought about it, you would see a newspaper and what was inside the newspaper, and you would know that that was the news. It came from a newsroom. Whereas now you can see a tweet where someone is just making a claim or a statement, and people will often take it at face value without even really realizing how it might be like subconsciously affecting them, or without necessarily stopping to fact check it to fact check it, because that's just not really the way that social media is set up. It's not used to having someone sit with a post and really digest it and see if they agree with it, see if it seems realistic or even like real, but instead it's just this like short-term consumption. And I do think that like young kids are going to be very affected by that, especially with apps like TikTok blowing up, where there's very little room for basically like critical thought on the app, or even pushback against other people's. Like it's very hard to see if someone posts something that isn't real or that is just like slightly false, or just contains misinformation in general. It's very hard for someone to then reply to it and then be like, hey, this is not real, this has misinformation in it, and also spread it to the same audience. So a lot of times I do think there are people who are getting misled about things on social media, and that's just why it's kind of up to us to know how to spot what is real and what's not, or even not even if you look at something you're like, I know that's not real. That doesn't have to be the end goal, but it's just like know that if something seems far-fetched a bit, to like be like, oh, I should look into that. I should spend longer than 5 seconds looking at it, and I should just do a quick Google search. And I think that that's going to just be increasingly important with social media.
Well, thank you. Dana, what are your thoughts on all of this?
Just to clarify, it's regarding technology, correct?
Yeah, you just like the way that social media is changing the way we're communicating, and how you had to like adapt your project, but also just in general like how we're adapting to it.
Great question. So as a software engineer, obviously have a lot of thoughts on this. Technology is definitely one of the key proponents to how news is being spread. Like, I think we can all basically agree that no one really relies on print or reads print anymore. So on top of thinking about how social media is affecting the way we consume information and think about things, I think there's two main factors to think about. One, how is the business model and platforming of journalists going to be continued and changed in the coming years? And then also, how can we question and improve our principles that a lot of journalists rely on day to day? A lot of principles that are certain. Well, the one thing I love about journalism is it's changed over the decades so many times. The way we define objectivity, the way we write articles, and the way we approach different topics. Journalism at its core is necessary in a free press society for a democracy, but the way we define journalism and the free press over the decades actually has changed quite a bit. So it's very important to think about with new mediums coming in the same way that when television became a thing for news, a lot more information became accessible in that way because people could really see what was going on, for instance, during the civil rights movement. And that was a big shift in journalism and how we got information across. So with social media now, we're getting access to information much more quickly, much faster, and there's different things we need to think about. There's deepfakes. There's also lots of misinformation spread very easily. And there's also very real realities of people falling down these pipelines of misinformation, seen with QAnon and other major issues that have caused really detrimental problems in our democracy. Us as journalists have to think about how we define objectivity and play with the rules of social media to make sure that at its core we are protecting our democracy, and that objectivity isn't necessarily both sidism, because there's a lot more nuance to topics now, and social media allows for that. And I think as journalists, we need to embrace that fully. And on the other end, more as a software engineer, which is I work on day to day, is the tooling and platform that journalism relies on, as well as the business model. It is so important to make tools that make journalists' lives a lot easier on the internal side, as well as create platforms that allow for access to information a lot easier on our side, on the client side, or as the reader side. So it's really important to think about ways how we can take information versus having a long form piece and find new ways to really allow readers to interact with it and make journalists' lives a lot easier. And that's where I think AI and machine learning comes in, where I think people are very quick to think, oh, is it just going to be automation of articles? Not necessarily. AI and machine learning can be as simple as helping reporters collect and clean data a lot more faster and really allow for people to free up their time to do the heart of humanity that's in reporting by allowing for our tools to dig deeper and build better and think about how these tools and new ways of information can improve the business model of journalism for sustainability, but also find new ways to get that information across.
Right on. So with your, I'm going to start with you again, Dana. As you know, you're thinking about all these things, and with your project, how are you going to take both a project and then these principles and such and apply them to your career going forward?
Yeah, great question. So my career and goal in life is to continue on a path of news engineering, which is basically working as an engineer who helps solve problems in computational journalism spaces. That is currently what I'm doing for work right now as a news engineering intern, and I love it a lot. And this project really taught me to think about how I can create content, build a product, as well as build the tooling and infrastructure and maintain it on a full level that really allowed me to understand all aspects of building. So a lot of what I do in day-to-day work is how the tooling is functioning, making sure how fast the tooling is functioning, and that it works well, which is really important because it's basically a support structure for journalists. A big thing about this project outside of the news literacy aspect that really helped me as a news engineer was how complicated it was to build from absolutely nothing, no WordPress, no help, just like full plain from scratch and building it to be fully deployed online and managing everything from the domain as well as the content and the product itself. And that's very important to think about in terms of how journalists relate to engineers and product people and everything in between. It's allowed me to better understand how to build tools that are effective for people, help with journalists, and use both sides with my experience working as a journalist and experience as an engineer to really bring the bridges together and allow for people to come up with more innovative ways and get excited about technology in newsroom spaces. This product helped a ton with my skills as an engineer, and then also in terms of being someone who can convey information in a better and easier to understand way. Very passionate about accessible technology, and my goal in the future is to get a lot more people involved on the engineering side in the journalism space. Coding is for everyone. I believe there's a lot more difficult things out there than coding, so everyone can definitely try it. But I also think it's important because 10 years from now, I believe definitely more than half of the individuals in the newsroom will be coding to some degree, if not more than 75%, because that's the way it's going. But it's something to be excited about and something to learn in terms of a new platforming of journalists. So I'm excited to be a news engineer and continue on that path. And this project really jump-started that for me. So I'm very passionate about this competition in the project and how much it's really helped me grow in my career.
I'm so glad to hear that passionate response. Josh, how are you going to apply what you've created, in your career going forward?
I guess with the coasters that I made for this project, right now I'm trying to figure out how to make them in a more efficient way and higher quality. Because basically what I had for the competition was a working demo. So really just looking at the process of manufacturing these, making them look better. And then, of course, ultimately implementing them or giving them to newsrooms to utilize to spread their own content. So I think really what my role would be in this is, being the communicator between the innovation side and the newsroom, so that they know, hey, there's this tool out here that you can use now. A lot of smartphones can pick it up, and many more probably within the next year. Most smartphones or smartphone users would be able to use these coasters. You should implement this. I've proven that they work. I've proven that statistically people are going to interact with them. They're lower cost than printing, and you're kind of bridging that gap between the digital content and the tangible stuff that you can hold in your hand like a coaster. So I think this will bridge that gap, and I'm hoping to keep working on this to actually implement this on a wider scale.
Right on. And Katey, how are you going to implement this in your career going forward?
Yeah, so I guess to preface that, me and my team, Mia and Kayla are not here, unfortunately, but we're a mix of PR, journalism, and advertising majors at the SOJC in the University of Oregon. And so we all have like different paths that all emerge like out of media. But I guess personally, I'm an advertising intern, and recently the people at my office were talking about the metaverse. And I think that's really interesting to think about in terms of news literacy, because like VR journalism is a thing, and it could be even bigger in the next 10 years or so. And that could also, one, present a lot of opportunities, but two, also open a whole can of worms in terms of misinformation. So if the team ever gets back together again, it might be interesting to see how we can teach news literacy on that kind of new media that's emerging. Yeah, so that's personally how I see the project fitting into my career goals, and Kendall can talk more about.
And Kendall?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm coming from a journalism background, and this is kind of an abstract answer, but if you think about it, or the way I was kind of thinking about it especially, is that our audience, middle schoolers, they're not that much younger than I am now. Like, it's like we're within the same decade. So the people who we are teaching, or like the middle schoolers of today, are going to be the future news consumers when I am when I am hopefully going to be working in like journalism. So teaching this, like, it's like teaching an appreciation for the news and also how to correctly use it, the reasons why it's important. The strengths of local journalism are all things that should be passed on to the younger generations, because they're going to grow up and they're going to be the ones that are literally supporting the news industry in the future. So it's like, if anything, I'm teaching my future readers, hopefully, that this is why news is important, and this is how to collect the correct information.
Well, thank you. And so, Dana, did you want to weigh in on how you're going to take your project going forward? I already asked you that. I'm sorry. What I meant to ask you was thinking about news literacy and what Kendall touched upon with that y'all aren't that much older than students. You're engaging students who are coming up, and the next generation of people who are going to be shaping the future. So why should they care about media literacy, and what's your case for why they should care? And so I'm going to start with you, Dana.
Yeah, media literacy is very important, as seen. Media literacy and the free press, and understanding how the free press can serve you and function, are what holds our democracy together. It's what is the standard for a free society, having a free press, because it's an outlet for the people to better express themselves and express viewpoints and show what is going on in a truthful manner, versus having like one outlet of not having the people have that free sense of speech. I say that because a lot of people sort of get the press misconstrued nowadays, with often just being people who propagate propaganda and spread fear, but that's actually a tactic often used in societies that are trying to sort of level out the playing field and prevent outspoken voices from speaking up and prevent movement and change. And as seen in recent events, it's definitely important to have a free press and understand news literacy, to see what's truly going on and understand what's going on. So moving forward, it's very, very important for people to understand media literacy and educate themselves, and from a core and young age, and have that be a staple part of curriculum. And it's also important for journalists to include in their coverage and the way they approach things, and understanding that people often get scared of journalists, which is like shouldn't be a thing, but unfortunately it is. So it should be part of our things of over-explaining the work that we do and how everything functions. And although it is so important for readers to understand media literacy in children, to make sure that we're getting factual information and being informed citizens of society, it's also so important for journalists to keep that in mind too. People may not always understand the work that you're doing, and that's okay. That's part of your job to explain what's going on. And I think that's so important moving forward to really have a connected, explanation-heavy society with journalists and people working together to really make sure that the communities are represented and everyone really knows what's going on, especially in light of how everything is shifting. And media literacy is important as we see, like people mentioned before, a lot more people can have access to information and post it quickly. Having those fundamentals of how to share information in a factual way is so, so important. And as you can tell, I'm very passionate about news literacy, but especially with everything going on now, it's more important than ever to really be informed about how our society is functioning and what's going on.
Well, thank you, Josh. The case for media literacy for.
I think it was summarized pretty well, but it is important to know, I guess, to have media literacy, to know what's going on, know why journalists do what they do, know, I guess, what the standards are for journalism, because it's definitely changed over the past 100 years. It shifted back and forth between being more objective to being more of a commentary. It's gone back and forth between those two, but I think being able to identify the differences between different news sources that are, I guess, more on the fact side and draw your own opinions versus these are my opinions and I'm sharing with you and you can disagree or agree. And then the third option, which is like, this is how it is and I'm going to present it objectively, but it is actually more leaning one side than the other. I think it's important for people to have enough news literacy in order to determine, hey, am I getting something that is objective? Are these actually the things that are going on? Or maybe I should look at a different source that maybe I don't agree with, but might get a different perspective on what's actually going on. And then from there, draw your own conclusions as to whether or not the media that you're consuming is objective or if it is more of a commentary. I think that is something that a lot of people maybe don't realize or maybe never learned that, I guess not every person who says that they're a journalist is actually going to be telling you something that's objective or that they might be following some kind of agenda. So I think that being able to identify those instances where you might not be receiving the truth, I think that is probably the most important thing I guess the most important argument today for media literacy.
Katey, what's your take on it?
I would say that a specific part of media and also journalism is that one of the things we learned in school is that the media and journalism does not exist in a vacuum. Like there are a lot of social and political factors that go into the way media is produced. Like as an advertising major, I know advertising is a huge driver in how media is produced and how news articles are also written. And there's the whole native advertising problem that can emerge in journalism when they're trying to market something but also kind of deliver news. So that's another issue. And I think the importance of news literacy is that as a democratic society, or that's the ideal, is that for us to be able to hold institutions accountable, we have to look at how media and information is being spread, because how will we be able to be critical of the institutions in power and be truly democratic if we don't know exactly what's going on, or if we're only getting one filtered view of what's happening around us? So I think that's one of the important things in teaching news literacy, especially if you want to consider yourself a free person who can engage with whatever information they please. So yeah.
Thank you, Kendall. Would your case for media literacy?
Oh yeah, pretty much everybody touched on everything that I was going to mention, so I'll keep it short. But
I think one thing is that a lot of like disinformation, the reason why it spreads so quickly, or the reason why it does spread, is because it specifically tries to elicit that like emotional response from its readers, but stemming from a place of being false or exaggerated. And I think that that's honestly a lot of what, like that does contribute to people getting burnt out of the news in general because they're just faced with these like split second emotional responses based off of something that is just fully not true. So it's like being able to see something like that that's supposed to enrage you or make you like, or just like elicit that emotional response, and then being able to see it, take a step back from it, and then think critically about what parts of it are actually real and what parts are false or exaggerated is extremely important for just like anybody who's on social media, anyone who's reading the news, anyone who wants to be an informed citizen. Because the like what happens if you don't do that the step of stepping back and thinking critically is that I'm sure I've been guilty of this in the past, is like literally then you just pass it off on to other people, like word of mouth, as if it's true. And it's like, we just as people believe what our friends or like relatives, or like we just like believe what people say. I know I do, so it's like, I know that it's just an important aspect of being an informed citizen. It's like fact check yourself, fact check what you read, just to make sure that you are actually getting the correct information.
Well, thank you, and that's a good kind of way to wrap up the conversation. So the next conversation will be at 2 p.m. Eastern, and that's Talking Across the Divide. I'm sorry, 2 p.m. Central, Talking Across the Divide, and that'll be online here. So I really want to thank you all for joining us. So we have Josh Schipper from Purdue University in Fort Wayne. We have Dana Cassidy from the University of Florida. We have Katey Williams from the University of Oregon, and Kendall Porter from the University of Oregon. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.